Welcome to quiz class. Today we have a 100 question quiz on the 1960s. Please share your score in the comments. Question 1. Which country initiated the Great Leap Forward plan in the 1960s? The United States, China, or the United Kingdom? China. Who was the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom during most of the 1960s? Winston Churchill, Harold Wilson, or Margaret Thatcher? Harold Wilson. Which war was fought between Portugal's military and nationalist movements in Portugal's African colonies? Portuguese Colonial War, African Revolution, or Afro-Portugal War? Portuguese Colonial War. Which war resulted in Israel gaining control of the Sinai Peninsula, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Golan Heights? The Six-Day War, the Great Arab Invasion, or the Israeli-Gaza War? The Six-Day War. What event occurred in Japan in 1960? The bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Industrial Revolution, or a visit from President Dwight D. Eisenhower? A visit from President Dwight D. Eisenhower. What was the period of political upheaval and conflict in the Republic of the Congo between 1960 and 1965 called? The Congo Crisis, the Stonewall Riots, or the Naxalite Movement? The Congo Crisis. Who started the Cultural Revolution in China in 1966? Park Chung-hee, Mao Zedong, or Karl Marx? Mao Zedong. Where did the Naxalite movement begin in 1967? The United States, Northern Ireland, or India? India. What movement in Bangladesh led to the country's liberation in the early 1970s? The Stonewall Riots, the Suez Canal Crisis, or the Six-Point Movement? The Six-Point Movement. Where did the Compton's cafeteria riot occur in 1966? Mexico City, New York City, or San Francisco? San Francisco. Which of the following technologies was invented in the 1960s? Microwave, lasers, or television? Lasers. What is the significance of the integrated circuit? Enhanced communication networks, improved transportation systems, or it revolutionized the computer industry? Revolutionized the computer industry. What genre of music started to merge into a more international electric variant in the 1960s? Rock and roll, country, or pop? Rock and roll. What country gained its independence from Great Britain on October 1st, 1960? Nigeria, China, or Mexico? Nigeria. Who called the Second Vatican Council of the Catholic Church, which met from 1962 to 1965? Pope Francis, Pope Paul VI, or Pope John the 23rd? Pope John the 23rd. Which country experienced the Prague Spring in 1968, a movement from socialism with a human face? Poland, Czechoslovakia, or Hungary? Czechoslovakia. Which country's student and New Left protests in 1968 were influenced by events in the United States and France? Brazil, Mexico, or Argentina? Mexico. Which country's literary and cultural movement called themselves Hungryalists and faced arrests and charges? India, Japan, or Hungary? India. What is Japan's growth after World War II and the Cold War known as? Japanese economic miracle, From Uncle Sam, or the Great Growth? Japanese economic miracle. Who was the Prime Minister of South Africa who was killed in 1966? Hendrik Verwoerd, de Klerk, or Che Guevara? Hendrik Verwoerd. Which technology was kept undercover until later decades? The telephone, space travel, or television? Space travel. Who was the guerrilla leader executed by the CIA and Bolivian army in 1967? Robert F. Kennedy, Che Guevara, or Margaret Thatcher? Che Guevara. What was the most powerful earthquake recorded, rating 9.5 on the moment magnitude scale? The Skopje earthquake, Friday earthquake, or Valdivia earthquake? Valdivia earthquake. What was the dam flood in Italy in 1963 that killed approximately 2,000 people? The Vajont Dam, the Alghera Dam, or the Specchieri Dam disaster? The Vajont Dam disaster. Which style of rock music grew in popularity in the latter half of the 1960s? Folk rock, blues rock, or psychedelic? Folk rock. What genre of music achieved a degree of popularity throughout the 1960s in Latin America? Salsa, bossa nova, or calypso? Salsa. Which British band marked the start of the British invasion in the US? The Rolling Stones, the Beatles, or the Kinks? The Beatles. Which British music scene developed a distinctive and influential style dominated by electric guitar in the 1960s? British blues, British beat music, or British psychedelia? British blues. What was the hurricane in 1965 that caused severe damage to the US Gulf Coast? Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Betsy, or Hurricane Sandy? Hurricane Betsy. Which movement in the 1960s art world rebelled against the expressive drama and soul of abstract expressionism? Modern art, pop art, or minimalism? Pop art. Which movement in the 1960s art world embraced abstract and geometric art and played with the perception of the visual? Conceptual art, pop art, or op art? Op art. Which song by Bob Dylan brought protest songs to a wider public? Masters of War, Blowin' in the Wind, or Like a Rolling Stone? Blowin' in the Wind. Which song by the Animals was the first commercially successful folk song to be recorded with rock and roll instrumentation? Tequila, Mr. Tambourine Man, or House of the Rising Sun? House of the Rising Sun. What was the goal set by President Kennedy for the United States in the 1960s? To explore Mars, to land a man on the moon, or to build a space station in orbit? To land a man on the moon. Which organization became the prime mover behind the opposition to the war in Vietnam? The Communist Party, New Left, or Students for a Democratic Society? Students for a Democratic Society. What event in 1969 marked the first time humans landed on the moon? Apollo 1 fire mission, Apollo 8 mission, or Apollo 11 mission? The Apollo 11 mission. Which Supreme Court ruling declared that segregating children of Mexican and Latin descent was unconstitutional? Hernandez versus Texas, Brown versus the Board of Education, or Menendez versus Westminster? Menendez versus Westminster. Which civil rights organization in the Mexican American community was founded in 1968? American GI Forum, LULAC, or MALDEF? MALDEF. What was the name of Betty Friedan's book that questioned the role of women in society? The Feminine Mystique, The Beauty Myth, or The Second Sex? The Feminine Mystique. Which movement in the U.S. gained momentum in the early 1960s that focused on changing cultural and social norms for women? The Women's Liberation Movement, Wave of Women, or Second Wave Feminism? Second Wave Feminism. Which 1960s art movement celebrated simplicity and sought to break down traditional notions of sculpture and painting? Conceptual art, pop art, or minimalism? Minimalism. Which band's recording of Bob Dylan's Mr. Tambourine Man is considered the start of the folk rock movement? The Animals, Simon and Garfunkel, or The Byrds? The Byrds. Which New York-based singer-songwriter released the album The Velvet Underground and Nico in 1967? Lou Reed, Jimi Hendrix, or Willie Nelson? Lou Reed. Which country lost its direction in the space race after the death of chief designer Sergei Korolev in 1966? The Soviet Union, China, or United States? Soviet Union. Who was the cosmonaut killed when the parachutes on his Soyuz 1 flight failed? Sergei Korolev, Yuri Gagarin, or Vladimir Komarov? Vladimir Komarov. Which vaccine released in 1963 after being approved by the FDA? The measles vaccine, polio vaccine, or flu vaccine? The measles vaccine. What was discovered in 1964, proving the Big Bang the best theory of the origin and evolution of the universe? Dark matter, black holes, or cosmic microwave background? Cosmic microwave background. Which band emerged from the New York art and music scene in the mid to late 60s? The Byrds, Simon and Garfunkel, or The Doors? Simon and Garfunkel. What was introduced in 1965 as an artificial turf for sports fields? AstroTurf, Grassmaster, or Gravel Grate? AstroTurf. Who performed the first heart transplantation operation in South Africa in 1967? Professor Christiaan Barnard, Dr. Denton Cooley, or Dr. Michael DeBakey? Professor Christiaan Barnard. What was discovered in 1967, which is a rapidly spinning neutron star? Quasar, pulsar, or supernova? Pulsar. Which genre of music was characterized by an LSD-inspired vibe? Surf rock psych, psychedelic disco, or psychedelic rock? Psychedelic rock. Which guitarist emerged onto the scene in 1967 with a radically new approach to electric guitar? Jimi Hendrix, Jimmy Page, or Elvis Presley? Jimi Hendrix. Which band became an overnight sensation after their performance at the Monterey Pop Festival in 1967? The Beatles, the Rolling Stones, or Big Brother and the Holding Company? Big Brother and the Holding Company. Which band released the influential LP Sweetheart of the Rodeo in late 1968? The Doors, the Byrds, or the Rolling Stones? The Byrds. Who released the single Mrs. Robinson in 1968? The Beach Boys, Simon and Garfunkel, or the Supremes? Simon and Garfunkel. Which TV series was a favorite in the 1960s, receiving approximately 40 million views an episode? Doctor Who, The Andy Griffith Show, or The Flintstones? The Flintstones. Which fashion trend of the 1960s was popularized by Mary Quant? The Nehru jacket, bell-bottom jeans, or the mini skirt? The mini skirt. Where were the 1964 Summer Olympics held? Tokyo, Japan, New York City, USA, or Cape Town, South Africa? Cape Town, South Africa. Which country's team won the 1962 FIFA World Cup? England, Chile, or Brazil? Brazil. Which NBA team dominated the tournaments in the 1960s? The Boston Celtics, the Los Angeles Lakers, or the Chicago Bulls? Boston Celtics. Which sport became popular during the 1960s using a flying disc? Disc golf, frisbee, or disc tennis? Disc golf. Who won the World Championship in Formula One in the 1960s? Lewis Hamilton, Graham Hill, or Mick Schumacher? Graham Hill. Which band from Texas was the first to advertise themselves as psychedelic rock? Jefferson Airplane, The Doors, or the 13th Floor Elevators? The 13th Floor Elevators. Who starred in the movie Breakfast at Tiffany's? Audrey Hepburn, Grace Kelly, or Marilyn Monroe? Audrey Hepburn. Who won the Best Actor Oscar for the movie Lawrence of Arabia? Peter O'Toole, Paul Newman, or Marlon Brando? Peter O'Toole. Who played the lead role in the movie Gone with the Wind? Vivien Leigh, Bette Davis, or Katharine Hepburn? Vivien Leigh. Who directed the movie Citizen Kane? Alfred Hitchcock, Steven Spielberg, or Orson Welles? Orson Welles. Who wrote the book A Brief History of Vatican II? Giuseppe Albergo, Jamie Pensado, or Curtis Cate? Giuseppe Albergo. Who became President of the United States in 1961? Richard Nixon, John F. Kennedy, or Lyndon B. Johnson? John F. Kennedy. Who is considered the pioneer of American blues rock in the early 1960s? Jimi Hendrix, Lonnie Mack, or Paul Butterfield? Lonnie Mack. Which movie star had the highest average rating per movie according to critics and audiences? Julie Andrews, John Wayne, or Paul Newman? Julie Andrews. What was the domestic agenda promised by John F. Kennedy? New Deal, Great Society, or New Frontier? New Frontier. What event marked the beginning of the gay rights movement in 1969? Civil Rights Act, the 27th Amendment, or the Stonewall Riots? The Stonewall Riots. What was the name of the war that became the US government's top priority in the 1960s? The Cold War, the Korean War, or the Vietnam War? The Vietnam War. What act did President Johnson push through Congress in 1964 to prohibit discrimination? Voting Rights Act, Equal Pay Act, or Civil Rights Act? The Civil Rights Act. Who recorded the first true country rock album, Safe at Home? Graham Parsons, Chris Hillman, or the Byrds? Graham Parsons. Which songwriting duo wrote multiple #1 hits in the early 60s? Ellie Greenwich and Jeff Barry, Jerry Goffin and Carole King, or Barry Mann and Cynthia Weil? Jerry Goffin and Carole King. Who won the US presidential election in 1968? John F. Kennedy, Lyndon B. Johnson, or Richard Nixon? Richard Nixon. Which city saw protests at the 1968 Democratic National Convention? Paris, Chicago, or London? Chicago. Which university was taken over by anti-war protesters in New York? Yale University, Columbia University, or Harvard University? Columbia University. Which music festival in 1969 represented the peace and love generation? Lollapalooza, Woodstock, or Coachella? Woodstock. Which political party split in 1968? Greenpeace, the Republican Party, or the Democratic Party? The Democratic Party. What were the urban riots that erupted every summer since 1964 called? The Los Angeles riots, Summer Urban Riots, or Watts riots? The Watts riots. Who is considered a key figure in the emergence of soul music as an established movement? Marvin Gaye, Benny King, or Solomon Burke? Solomon Burke. Which of these actors had the highest box office earnings? Royal Dano, Jim Brown, or Richard Crenna? Jim Brown. Which president declared his intention to make the United States into a great society? Lyndon B. Johnson, Richard Nixon, or John F. Kennedy? Lyndon B. Johnson. What were the programs developed by Lyndon Johnson as part of the Great Society? Medicare and Medicaid, Head Start and Job Corps, Social Security and Medicare. Medicare and Medicaid. Where were the shots fired that killed John F. Kennedy? The Texas State Capitol, Grassy Knoll, or Texas School Book Depository? The Texas School Book Depository. What were American values in the 1960s? A liberal and progressive America, a conservative and subdued America, or a socialist America? A conservative and subdued America. Which political principles were reanimated and reinvented in the United States during the 60s? Authoritarianism and hierarchy, capitalism and consumerism, or equality and liberty? Equality and liberty. What characterized the emergence of youth culture in the 1960s? Conformity and obedience to societal norms, isolation and withdrawal, or self-expression, freedom, and experimentation? Self-expression, freedom, and experimentation. How did young men resist the Vietnam War draft? Opposing the war effort, burning draft cards, or protesting? Burning draft cards. What were the guiding principles of the counterculture movement and the hippie lifestyle? Peace, love, and freedom, rebellion and counterculture, or materialism, nomadism, and vandalism? Peace, love, and freedom. What landmark cases contributed to women's reproductive rights during the 1960s? Miranda versus Arizona, Brown versus the Board of Education, or Roe versus Wade? Roe versus Wade. What were the popular food and dietary trends of the 1960s? Traditional recipes and formal dining, gourmet cuisine and indulgence, or convenience foods and communal dining? Convenience foods and communal dining. How did the 1960s influence interior design and architecture? Space age aesthetics and open floor plans, minimalist aesthetics, or classic aesthetics and use of traditional materials? Space age aesthetics and open floor plans. What event sparked a new phase of the civil rights movement in the 60s? The assassination of President Kennedy, the passage of the Civil Rights Act, or sit-ins at Woolworth's lunch counter? Sit-ins at Woolworth's lunch counter. What was the purpose of the freedom rides organized by the Congress of Racial Equality? Protest against police brutality, to advocate for voting rights, or desegregate interstate transportation? To desegregate interstate transportation. What major steps did Richard Nixon take during his presidency? Promote racial equality, intensify the anti-war movement, or end the Cold War? To end the Cold War. Bonus question: what is the abbreviation for the Congress of Racial Equality? Let us know the answer in the comments. Thanks for playing this quiz. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell. See you next time.